Hello, I'm discussing 1919 and the labor unrest of that year in both Canada and the United States. After the war to end all wars concluded, Americans and Canadians hoped to put the devastating conflict behind them and return to better times. But 1919 was a period of readjustment. Both nations experienced significant social unrest as labor leaders demanded higher wages for workers. There were general strikes in Seattle, Washington, and Winnipeg, Manitoba. In those two cities, the cities more or less shut down. Canadians entered the war in 1914, and the federal government intervened on economic matters like never before. For example, the government took control of the marketing of wheat. It fixed prices in 1917 and 1918. By 1919, the government had established a state-operated compulsory pool known as the early version of the Canadian Wheat Board. During the war, the government also controlled the production and sale of coal, wood, and gasoline. One historian writes that, quote, Canadians learned to live with unprecedented government controls and involvement in their daily lives. Initially, the government used tariffs and federal bonds to finance the war. But in 1917, it imposed the first federal income tax. There was a 3% tax on families earning more than $3,000 a year. Months before the end of the war, the federal government created the Department of Soldiers' Civil Reestablishment to plan the demobilization of soldiers. The task was to integrate 300,000 returning troops who eventually returned to an economic recession. Many could not find employment. It was also a difficult year of disease. As was the case in other parts of the world, Canada lost many to the Spanish flu pandemic. An estimated 50,000 died, which was almost equal to the number of Canadian soldiers who died fighting the war. There was significant labor strife in 1919. During the war, Canadian labor put aside most grievances, but at the end of the war, with inflation and other issues at the fore, Canadian labor leaders sought more concessions from business owners. Buoyed by the perceived victory for workers in the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, labor leaders and activists promoted strikes to force the hand of employers. Had not workers restrained themselves during wartime? It was time to make up ground on wages. One clear sign of growing labor militancy was the rise of a single industrial union called One Big Union. One Big Union was formed in Western Canada at the time of the Winnipeg General Strike. A radical organization, One Big Union, believed in the inevitability of class struggle. At a 3-day meeting of labor leaders in Calgary, Alberta in March of 1914, One resolution stated, "This convention expresses its own conviction that the system of industrial Soviet control by selections of representatives from industries is more efficient and of greater political value than the present system of government by selection from districts. This convention declares its full acceptance of the principle of proletarian dictatorship as being absolute and efficient for the transformation of capitalist private property to communal wealth." It is notable that the measure ended with fraternal greetings to the Russian government. Several weeks later in Winnipeg, the building and metals trades went on a citywide strike when their employers did not grant a wage increase. The Winnipeg Trade and Labor Council, dominated by socialists, took the advice of the One Big Union to start a general strike. On May 1st, the city closed down when union workers from various quarters united together, striking for better wages and working conditions. Also, they wanted to see some kind of movement with collective bargaining. Even police officers and firefighters joined the strike in mid-May. Not all the police, but some did. City officials feared that One Big Union would seize control. As it was, the strike lasted several weeks. Fearing that other Canadian cities would copy Winnipeg, the federal government sent Arthur Hannan, who was the Minister of Justice and of the Interior. So he was sent to Winnipeg, and there he described the strike leaders as, quote, "revolutionists of various degrees and types, from crazy idealists down to ordinary thieves, with the better part, perhaps, of the latter type." The strike divided war veterans. They had fought side by side for 4 years, and now they opposed each other on Winnipeg streets. In fact, some veterans were designated special constables to keep strikers in check. In mid-June, Hannan ordered the arrest of labor leaders on charges of inciting a revolution. In fact, the federal government amended the criminal code, enlarging the definition of sedition and increasing the penalties for insurgency. The government also introduced retroactive amendments to the Immigration Act, thereby giving the government greater power to deport British-born immigrants suspected of promoting revolutionary socialism. During the strike, strikers clashed with police and supporters of the government. In one clash, when the Royal Canadian Mounted Police on horseback dispersed the crowd, a striker died. This became known as Bloody Saturday. 5 days later, June 26, the strike was over. Without making any gains, the strike committee threw in the towel. There were other labor protests and strikes elsewhere in Canada in 1919, but nothing comparable to what took place in Winnipeg. In general, the mood of labor militancy waned, even though Canada would continue to experience slow economic growth in the early 1920s. Unlike previous decades, Canada could not depend on British markets for trade and on British financial institutions for investment money. Britain had its own economic setbacks after the war. America also experienced labor unrest. The United States entered World War I in April 1917, over 2.5 years after its beginning. However, the war had an immediate impact on the American economy. There was a slight recession in the United States. When European investors sought to convert their American securities into cash, the rush to sell was too great for the market to absorb, and there was financial panic. The New York Stock Exchange did not return to full function. It had closed its doors on July 31st, 1914, and it had not returned to full function until April of 1915. Now, of course, Americans are not in the war. They don't enter the war until 1917, but there was this immediate consequence setback for America when the war began. And according to George Stebbins Noble, he wrote back in 1915, the fundamental reason for closing the exchange was that America, when the war broke out, was in debt to Europe, and that Europe was sure to enforce the immediate payment of that debt in order to put herself in funds to prosecute this greatest of all wars. There was to be an unexpected run on Uncle Sam's Bank, and the stock exchange was the paying teller's window through which the money was to be drawn out. So the window was closed to gain time. So that was quite a remarkable episode for the New York Stock Exchange to close its doors for those months. European investors were also anxious to trade their American dollars for gold, but there was a decrease in gold exports because there were fewer ships at wartime. Of course, many of the merchant ships were fearful of losing cargoes as the war was in play, and concerned with, for example, the Germans destroying ships. Fortunately, the recession did not last long, because in a few short months, there was a business boom in America when Europeans, notably the British and the French, increased their purchases of American goods. With fewer European goods being produced and an economic vacuum in world trade, the United States stepped forward and benefited nicely. The index of manufacturing production in 1916 had increased 30% above the 1913 number. One example is the United States Steel Corporation. This company had 561 million in sales in 1913, and that number, the sales rose to 902 million 3 years later in 1916. And also in America, unemployment basically disappeared. Some economists were highly critical of the economic policies of these years. Economist Murray Rothbard commented on the war collectivism of President Woodrow Wilson's administration. It was, quote, a totally planned economy run largely by big business interests through the instrumentality of the central government, which served as the model, the president, and the inspiration of state corporate capitalism for the remainder of the 20th century. End of quote. In 1913, the 16th Amendment brought forth the income tax. During the fiscal years of the war, 1915 to 1919, 53% of the total revenue came from income taxes on individuals and corporations. During the war, the top marginal rate hit 77%. Also, in 1913, there was the creation of the Federal Reserve System. As the central bank of the United States, it was to provide the nation with a safer, more flexible, and more stable monetary and financial system. At the end of World War I, no country in the world was stronger economically as the United States. The standard of living rose. The American people had more gadgets, conveniences, such as plumbing and electric lights, had more leisure time than anyone else. They also had a better and more diversified diet. And in 1919, many had an automobile. One American in 16 had an automobile. There was a post-war boom fed on markets renewed by pent-up demand and wartime savings. The economy was good, but for some workers, the gains in wages were often offset by rising prices and the increased cost of living. It was also a challenging time as the Spanish influenza pandemic hit the United States, killing about 700,000 Americans. In addition, returning troops had to compete for scarce jobs with workers recently discharged from the war industries. During the war, there had been an increase in labor union membership, but labor upheld a no-strike pledge. The no-strike agreements of wartime had restrained wages, and now union leaders across the land demanded higher wages. In 1919, rising inflation, accumulated grievances, and militant union leadership all contributed to a rise in strike action. In 1919, America witnessed more than 3,000 strikes involving more than 4 million workers. There was a general strike in Seattle, May Day riots in New York, Boston, and Cleveland, and major strikes in the steel and coal industries. The year, however, was not a good one for labor leaders. They suffered from charges that unions were under the influence of socialist-inspired radicals. The American tradition was to admire self-made people, something in tune with the American theme of pioneer and frontier life. There was a healthy respect for entrepreneurs and business people who built companies and provided jobs. There was some hostility to organized labor since labor union demands could mean higher consumer prices. There was also the perception of labor unions being top-heavy with bureaucracy and not always sensitive to the wishes of the rank-and-file membership. Not all workers wanted to strike, especially if the demands of union leaders were unrealistic in the eyes of workers. And it became obvious that socialists and other radicals had success in infiltrating various unions, and not all workers were happy about this development. When America entered the war, the Socialist Party of America presented its case against the war. Quote, "The Socialist Party of the United States in the present grave crisis solemnly reaffirms its allegiance to the principle of internationalism and working class solidarity the world over, and proclaims its unalterable opposition to the war just declared by the government of the United States." End of quote. The party's final statement was clear. Quote, "No greater dishonor has ever forced upon a people than that which the capitalist class is forcing upon this nation against its will." In the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution, revolutionary socialists in many countries looked to Russia as a model of socialist change. Portland-raised radical and journalist John Reed wrote of the 10 days that shook the world. Reed was this journalist who wrote about the Bolshevik Revolution and was very favorable of it. Historian James N. Gregory writes that the revolution rattled the foundation of labor politics in Seattle. Hope and fear both radiated from the news. For committed radicals, this was confirmation. This was the revolution that would deliver on the theories and promises that had animated radical movements for generations. This was the start of the historic turn that would replace the cruelties of capitalism with a society based on science and socialism. After the war, American socialists, both democratic and revolutionary types, made their voices heard. Their numbers were small, but their rhetoric and endorsement of strike action resulted in growing fears of radicalism and subversion sweeping the nation. There were rumors of assassinations of public officials. Someone sent a bomb to the home of Seattle Mayor Ole Hannan on April 28th, 1919. Authorities discovered and dismantled it. Tragically, the next day, a bomb arrived at the Atlanta home of former Senator Thomas Hardwick. The bomb blew the hands off Hardwick's maid. So, very tragic turn of events. There were over 30 bombs sent to public officials across America, but fortunately, authorities and others intercepted them. One target was Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who had sentenced socialist Victor Berger to jail. In June, a bomb damaged the home of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. There were no injuries to the Palmers, but the bomber blew himself up. Found at the scene was a leaflet with threats against the capitalist class. As for strike action, the most notable one was the general strike in Seattle. Seattle was a medium-sized city on the periphery in the far northwest corner of the United States. From Seattle, it took days on a train to reach other major American cities. Earlier, the Seattle economy depended on coal, lumber, oats, hops, and canned salmon. But the war years brought government shipbuilding contracts. Seattle shipbuilding companies employed tens of thousands of new workers. The city's population surged and reached 315,000 in 1920. As a boom town, Seattle counted only 10% of its population not from another state or another country. The overwhelming majority of the population claimed European ancestry. There were 10,000 Swedish and 43,000 Danish and Finnish immigrants as part of the city's working class. There were also many Germans, Irish, Italians, and smaller contingents of Poles, Russians, and other Eastern Europeans. As for non-whites, there were about 8,000 Japanese, 3,000 African Americans, and 1,350 Chinese Americans. The Japanese owned dozens of stores, cafes, and cheap hotels. However, most Japanese did the work that others avoided, notable marginal laboring or service work. For 3 months before the beginning of the general strike, the Spanish flu pandemic claimed the lives of 1,400 in Seattle. During this period, schools, theaters, churches, and other gathering spaces were closed. Wearing face masks on streetcars and in public settings was mandatory. It was the general strike, more or less, that put Seattle on the map. Mayor Ole Hannan gained national attention when he characterized Seattle's general strike as a conflict between Bolshevism and Americanism. He wrote, quote, "Streetcar gongs ceased their clamor. Newsboys cast their unsold papers into the street. From the doors of mill and factory, store and workshop streamed 65,000 working men. School children with fear in their hearts hurried home. The life stream of a great city stopped." So Hannan presented a dismal picture. Shortly before the strike deadline, the Seattle Central Labor Council declared, "We are undertaking the most tremendous move ever made by labor in this country, a move which will lead no one knows where. We do not need hysteria. We need the iron march of labor." The council's agenda was bold. Labor will not only shut down the industries, but labor will reopen under the management of the appropriate trades, such activities as are needed to preserve public health and public peace. If the strike continues, labor may feel led to avoid public suffering by reopening more and more activities under its own management. The strike took place over a 5-day period in February 1919, far shorter than what took place in Winnipeg. It was the first major general strike in America's history. It began with shipyard workers who expected a wage increase after 2 years of a wage freeze by the federal government. The workers, mental trades, Council Union Alliance declared a strike, and Seattle's 110 local unions threw in their support. In essence, the city stopped working. With stores closed and streetcars not running, non-union workers were idle. About 25,000 union members had joined the 35,000 already on strike. Much of the remaining workforce was idle as stores closed and streetcars stopped running. The General Strike Committee, composed of delegates from the key striking unions, forged on despite little support from the local and national media. One shipbuilding worker recounted his experience. Quote, "Now the General Strike Committee never unseated the mayor or his councils, but it was the city government. In fact, it decided what was to go on and what was not to go on. The council established its own police, but they were without weapons. It was unnerving to have unelected people in control of the city." Mayor Hannan deputized and armed 2,400 supporters, and the federal government moved 2 army battalions into the city from nearby Camp Lewis. One serious Hannan threat was the implementation of martial law. Except for radical literature, the unions received no positive coverage from newspapers. The episode appeared to be un-American, and many unions stopped supporting the strike. Only the most militant stayed committed. But Hannan got the edge as the police were in the process of arresting key radicals and socialists. By February 11, the strike was over. Political science, Robin Friedman, concludes that the Seattle General Strike is a textbook example of the ineffectiveness of the non-revolutionary general strike as a labor weapon for attaining any but the narrowest goals. Only if a general strike is limited in duration and the goals are narrowly defined can it be successful. Without narrow goals, understood by striker, opponent, and neutral observer, a general strike will be treated as a revolution. As Friedman saw it, a general strike was fine as long as it was planned properly with clear goals. James Gregory argues that Seattle General Strike foreshadowed the outcomes of the 1919 year of strikes, outcomes that included more defeats than victories for workers and led to a fundamental reshaping of labor and radical movements. The Red Scare that followed hindered the plans of radicals. The Red Scare that followed hindered the plans of radicals, limited the capacities of unions, and ended what historians call the progressive era. Socialist themes faded, and the 1920s would be a decade of free market capitalism encouraged by Republican administrations. Support for a socialist economic model was minuscule. Actually, even strikes with weak connections to radicals received little support from Americans. The defeat of many strikes in the steel, coal, and textile sectors established the pattern for the decline of unionism in the 1920s. One business response to union activity was to give workers certain perks and benefits. Some businesses honored the 8-hour day, the sale of company stocks to workers at reduced prices, group insurance, bonuses, and also the establishment of recreational facilities. Company unions also replaced regular trade unions. Business people expected that these changes would bring greater economic prosperity. Okay, to sum up, radical elements in both Canada and the United States were influenced by Marxist ideology and some form of socialist economics. Some historians argue that global capitalism, destabilized by World War I, was undergoing a period of significant transition and reorganization. Labor conflict and the rise of solidarity movements was a logical and widespread response, end quote. But socialist ideas received little support from the general population. Both Canada and the United States experienced less labor problems in the 1920s. The major economic story for the decade that followed 1919, especially for Americans, was economic growth rather than labor conflict. Thank you.